Welcome to the American Valor World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. January 20th, 1944, 1915, Monte Cassino, Italy. 19-year-old Private James White of the 36th Texas Infantry Division peered through the darkness at the swollen waters of the Rapido River. The ancient Benedictine monastery loomed ominously on the mountaintop above, its silhouette black against the night sky. Within hours, over 2,000 Americans would be killed, wounded, or captured in one of the most catastrophic military operations of World War II. This story is based entirely on documented accounts, military records, and the sworn testimonies of those who survived the nightmare that unfolded in the shadow of Monte Cassino. The Italian campaign had been grinding on since September 1943, when Allied forces landed at Salerno. The advance northward had been painfully slow, measured in yards rather than miles, with each hill and valley fiercely contested by German forces under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. The German defensive strategy had been masterful. A series of prepared defensive lines that took full advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain, forcing the Allies to fight uphill against entrenched positions time and again. By December 1943, the Allied advance had stalled completely before the Gustav Line, a series of formidable German fortifications that stretched across the entire Italian peninsula. At its center was Monte Cassino, a 1,700-foot mountain crowned by a 6th-century Benedictine abbey founded by Saint Benedict himself. From this commanding position, German observers could track every Allied movement in the valleys below, directing artillery fire with devastating precision. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was one of unrelenting misery for the soldiers on both sides. Incessant rain turned roads into quagmires and filled foxholes with freezing water. Temperatures hovered just above freezing during the day and plunged below it at night. Trench foot became epidemic among the American troops, who were ordered not to remove their boots for fear they wouldn't be able to get them back on when their feet swelled. Medical records from the 36th Division documented that over 40% of hospital admissions during this period were for exposure in trench foot rather than combat injuries. Major General Fred L. Walker, commander of the 36th Infantry Division, stood on Monte Trocchio on January 16, 1944, examining the terrain through his binoculars. At 56 years old, Walker was a veteran of World War I who had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism at the Marne River in France. Now, he found himself staring at another river, but under vastly different circumstances. The Rapido River flowed between his position and the German defenses at the base of Monte Cassino. Though only 25 to 50 feet wide, it was swift-flowing, 10 to 15 feet deep, with steep banks 3 to 6 feet high. The ground around it had been deliberately flooded by the Germans, creating a waterlogged morass that would bog down any attacking force. Walker's division had already suffered heavy losses in the preceding months. At the Salerno landings in September, they had lost 1,900 men. In the brutal fighting around San Pietro in December, they had lost another 2,400. Many of the experienced soldiers had been replaced with green recruits who had never seen combat. The division that now prepared to assault the Rapido was a shadow of its former self. On January 16, Walker was summoned to 5th Army headquarters to meet with Lieutenant General Mark Clark. Clark informed Walker that his division would be crossing the Rapido on January 20 to establish a bridgehead through which the 1st Armored Division would advance into the Liri Valley. The operation was intended to support the upcoming amphibious landing at Anzio, scheduled for January 22. By attacking across the Rapido, the 36th Division would supposedly draw German forces away from Anzio and prevent them from reinforcing that area. Walker immediately protested the plan. In his diary that night, he wrote, "I don't see how we, or any other division, can possibly succeed in crossing the Rapido. The river is the principal obstacle of the German main line of resistance. I do not know of a single case in military history where an attempt to cross an unfordable river that is incorporated into the enemy's main line of resistance has succeeded. So according to history, we may not succeed. His concerns were numerous and specific. The approaches to the river were exposed to observation from Monte Cassino. The ground was waterlogged, making it difficult to move men and equipment. The rubber boats provided for the crossing were unwieldy and vulnerable to enemy fire. The improvised footbridges would be heavy and clumsy to carry by hand to the river, easily punctured by shell fire, and difficult to launch due to the high banks and swift current. The Germans had heavily mined both sides of the river and set up interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Despite Walker's protests, Clark insisted that the operation go forward as planned. The needs of the broader strategic picture, he argued, outweighed the tactical difficulties. Walker later confided to his aide, Captain William Stringer, "This is a tragedy in the making. I've done everything I can to prevent it, but I've been overruled. God help us tomorrow." The night before the attack, Walker gathered his regimental commanders to issue final orders. Colonel William H. Martin of the 143rd Infantry Regiment and Lieutenant Colonel Aaron W. Wyatt, Jr., temporarily commanding the 141st Infantry Regiment, received their instructions with grim faces. They knew, as did Walker, that they were sending their men into a meat grinder. January 19, 1944, the rain that had been falling steadily for days finally stopped, but the damage was done. The ground was a thick, clinging mud that made every step an effort. Soldiers slogged through it with curses on their lips, their uniforms caked with muck that never seemed to dry. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a biting wind cut through wet clothing, chilling men to the bone. Private Albert DeFazio of the 143rd Infantry Regiment later recalled the mood that night. Everyone was very, very leery about the attack, because we all felt sure it was going to be difficult. You're in a foxhole for a while, then you move up. You might spend 1 or 2 nights in the same place, then move forward. It was raining all the time and it was cold. My feet were frozen. Most of the guys had frozen feet. They told us not to take our boots off because you never knew when we might have to get out of somewhere in a hurry. And if we did take our boots off, you might not be able to get them back on because your feet would swell up. Staff Sergeant Harry Allen of the 143rd Regiment wrote in a letter home that was never mailed. "The waiting is the worst part. We all know what's coming tomorrow, and there's not a man among us who thinks we're going to make it across that river in one piece. But we'll try, because that's our job. I've written to Mother and told her not to worry if she doesn't hear from me for a while. I didn't want to frighten her by saying I might not be writing at all anymore." In preparation for the crossing, officers briefed their men on the details of the operation. The 141st Regiment would cross on the right, near the village of Sant'Angelo, while the 143rd would cross on the left. The 142nd Regiment would be held in reserve. The crossing would begin at 2000, after a massive artillery barrage to suppress German defenses. Engineers would clear paths through minefields, and the infantry would carry inflatable rubber boats to the river. Once across, they would establish a bridgehead so that engineers could construct more substantial bridges for armor to cross. It sounded simple in theory. In practice, it would be anything but. The men of the 36th Division spent the day checking their equipment. Weapons were cleaned meticulously, though everyone knew they would soon be clogged with mud again. Ammunition was distributed, along with extra rations and medical supplies. Each platoon was assigned rubber boats, unwieldy, 12-man craft that weighed over 300 pounds when fully inflated. Captain John L. Chapin of Company E, 141st Regiment, gathered his men that afternoon. His company was unique. Every enlisted man was Mexican-American, from Texas. Some were U.S. citizens, others were not, but all had volunteered to serve. "Tonight we cross the river," he told them. "We're going to catch hell. I won't lie to you about that, but I know you'll do your duty, as you always have. Check your equipment, get some rest if you can, and be ready to move out at 1800. Private First Class Jose Mendoza of Company E later remembered Chapin's words. "He was always straight with us, and we appreciated that. We knew it was going to be bad, but when Captain Chapin said we could do something, We believed him. He never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. As darkness fell, the men ate their last hot meal before the assault, a meager serving of beans and hardtack, washed down with bitter coffee. Some wrote letters home, sealing them carefully in waterproof packets. Others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Many prayed. Private James White later recalled, "I remember thinking about my parents back in Pennsylvania. They had no idea what I was about to go through. I wondered if I'd ever see them again." A lot of the guys were thinking the same thing, I guess. Nobody talked much that night. At 1800, under cover of darkness, the men of the 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiments began moving toward their assembly areas near the riverbank. They carried heavy rubber boats, wooden footbridges, ammunition, and radios. The approach march was an ordeal in itself. The muddy ground had been partially cleared of mines, but many deadly devices remained hidden in the muck. Engineers had laid white tape to mark safe paths, but in the darkness, these were difficult to follow. Lieutenant Robert Maxwell of the 143rd Regiment described the approach in his after-action report. The men struggled under heavy loads through mud that came up to their knees in places. Progress was painfully slow, and we fell behind schedule almost immediately. The rubber boats became heavier with each step, as mud clung to them and to the men carrying them. Several times we had to halt while men were extricated from particularly deep mud holes. All the while, we were acutely aware that German observers might detect our movement at any moment. By 1900, the attacking forces had reached their assault positions about 500 yards from the river. The night was pitch black, with no moon to provide illumination. This was both a blessing and a curse. It hid their movements from German observers, but it also made it extremely difficult to maintain direction and cohesion. January 20, 1944, 1900. The silence of the night was shattered by the thunderous roar of American artillery. A massive barrage of 31,000 shells pounded German positions across the river. The ground shook beneath the soldiers' feet as flash after flash illuminated the night sky. The barrage was intended to suppress German defenses and keep the defenders in their bunkers during the crucial initial minutes of the crossing. Lieutenant Colonel Wyatt of the 141st Regiment gave the order to advance to the river. The men shouldered their heavy loads and began moving forward in small groups. The going was painfully slow, as they had to navigate through mud and debris while maintaining noise discipline. "Mines! Mines!" The first screams echoed through the night as men triggered the deadly devices, their bodies torn apart in violent explosions. Despite the engineers' best efforts, many anti-personnel mines remained hidden in the mud. The explosions immediately alerted German gunners, who began firing illumination flares that turned night into day, revealing the advancing Americans in stark relief. Private White later recalled, "I was carrying a mortar over my right shoulder and an M1 carbine positioned horizontally across my shoulders. We were getting shelled, so of course I hit the dirt 2 or 3 times. Every time I did, I always reached back to make sure my gun was still there. One time I reached back and my gun was gone. I had to go back about 10 yards and there it was, lying in the mud." As the men reached the riverbank, they encountered the first major problem. The swift current had changed course since their reconnaissance, making many of their planned crossing points unusable. The high banks made it difficult to launch the rubber boats, and as they struggled to maneuver the unwieldy craft into the water, German machine guns opened fire. Artillery and Nebelwerfer drumfire methodically searched both bridgeheads, while machine guns opened on every sound, wrote historian Rick Atkinson. GIs inched forward, feeling for tripwires and listening to German gun crews reload. To stand or even to kneel was to die. The Nebelwerfer was a particularly terrifying German weapon, a 6-barreled rocket launcher that fired 150-millimeter projectiles. American troops called it the "screaming Mimi" because of the distinctive howling sound the rockets made in flight. Now, these rockets rained down on the men at the riverbank, their explosions sending deadly fragments in all directions. Staff Sergeant Thomas McCall of the 143rd Regiment led his machine gun section toward the river. As the boats were launched, they immediately came under intense fire. One by one, McCall's men were hit. Rather than retreat, McCall pressed forward alone, firing his weapon at German positions across the river. He managed to silence 2 enemy machine guns before being severely wounded and captured. For his extraordinary valor, he would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Private First Class Mendoza of Company E witnessed the chaos at the riverbank. The boats were getting hit as soon as they touched the water. Some of them sank immediately, and the men were swept away by the current. Others made it partway across before machine gun fire tore them apart. It was like something out of a nightmare. Men screaming, explosions everywhere, and that damn river just kept flowing, carrying away the wounded and the dead. Captain Chapin of Company E was everywhere at once, organizing his men, helping to launch boats, and maintaining calm in the face of disaster. When one boat was hit and began to sink mid-river, Chapin plunged into the freezing water to help the struggling men. He managed to pull 2 soldiers to safety before being hit by machine gun fire. His body was never recovered. By 2200, it was clear that the initial crossing was in serious trouble. Only a handful of boats had successfully reached the far shore, depositing small groups of Americans who found themselves isolated and under constant fire from German positions. The engineers attempted to construct footbridges, but German artillery targeted these with deadly accuracy, sending bodies and broken equipment tumbling into the churning waters. Colonel Martin of the 143rd Regiment reported to General Walker, "The situation is critical. We estimate less than 50 men have made it across, and they're pinned down without support. The engineers have been unable to construct bridges due to heavy fire. Request permission to suspend the crossing until we can bring up more artillery support." Walker, torn between his duty to his men and his orders from Clark, reluctantly denied the request. "Continue the operation as planned," he ordered. "Commit your reserve companies to support those who have crossed." By midnight, it was clear that the initial crossing had failed catastrophically. Of the 1st Battalion, 141st Regiment, which had crossed with over 800 men, fewer than 100 remained alive and unwounded on the far bank. The rest had been killed, wounded, or swept away by the current. Sergeant Frank DiStefano of the 141st Regiment was among the few who made it across. In his diary, later recovered after the war, he wrote, "We're in hell. There are maybe 30 of us left from my company, pinned down in a drainage ditch about 100 yards from the river. German machine guns cover every inch of ground. 2 men tried to make a run for a better position and were cut down instantly. We can hear our wounded calling for help, but anyone who goes out there is dead. No sign of the rest of the battalion. We may be all that's left." Throughout the night, sporadic attempts were made to reinforce the men who had crossed, but each attempt met with the same devastating result. German artillery and machine guns had pre-registered the crossing points and hit them with unerring accuracy. The few boats that remained intact were insufficient to transport significant numbers of troops, and the swift current made swimming across a death sentence in the freezing water. By 0300 on January 21st, both regimental commanders were reporting that further crossing attempts that night would be futile. General Walker, with a heavy heart, ordered a suspension of operations until daylight, when better artillery support could be provided. January 21st, 1944. Dawn revealed the full horror of the night's failed assault. Bodies floated in the river or lay scattered across the eastern bank. Wounded men cried out for medics, but reaching them meant crossing open ground under German fire. The survivors huddled in foxholes, exhausted and demoralized. Private Albert DeFazio was wounded by an artillery shell in the back and ordered to return across the river for medical aid. While crossing, he and another soldier assisted a wounded lieutenant back to the aid station, dragging him for a couple miles in a rubber raft, military records state. The journey took hours, as they had to avoid German fire while managing the unwieldy raft with their wounded burden. DeFazio later recalled, "When we finally reached the aid station, it was overflowing with wounded. Men were lying everywhere, some crying, others just staring blankly. The medics were doing their best, but there were just too many casualties. I remember one young doctor, couldn't have been more than 25, covered in blood up to his elbows, working non-stop. His eyes had this 1,000-yard stare, like he'd seen too much already. Medical reports from the 36th Division's field hospitals documented the overwhelming influx of casualties. One report stated, triage procedures were implemented due to the volume of wounded. Priority was given to those with the best chance of survival. Many men died while awaiting treatment due to the severity of their wounds and the time elapsed since injury. On average, soldiers wounded on the Rapido received definitive treatment 9 hours and 41 minutes after they were hit. Despite the disaster, General Clark ordered the attack to continue. At 2100 that night, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 141st Regiment launched another attempt across the river. They found no survivors from the previous night's crossing. All had been killed or captured. Once again, German fire tore into the attacking Americans. Lieutenant Colonel Wyatt reported, "The second assault is meeting even heavier resistance than the first. The Germans were clearly expecting us and have reinforced their positions. Our men are taking heavy casualties before even reaching the river." Private White was among those who made it to the far bank during this second attempt. "We were getting hit from all sides," he recalled years later. "Men were falling all around me. I saw my buddy take a direct hit from a mortar shell. There was nothing left of him. We managed to advance about 200 yards from the river before we were pinned down in a drainage ditch. There were maybe 40 of us, cut off from the rest of the battalion. We had no radio, no heavy weapons, just our rifles and what ammunition we carried." Throughout the night, the isolated groups of Americans on the western bank fought desperately to maintain their precarious positions. German infantry launched counterattacks, attempting to eliminate the small American footholds before they could be reinforced. The fighting was close quarters and brutal, often hand-to-hand in the darkness. Sergeant Michael Barella of Company E, 141st Regiment, described one such encounter. "They came at us just before dawn, maybe 30 of them. We could hear them speaking German as they approached. We let them get within 20 yards before opening fire. It was chaos after that. Muzzle flashes in the dark, men screaming, the clatter of grenades. I emptied my M1 into the shadows, reloaded and fired again. When it was over, there were bodies everywhere, some of them ours, some German. We had maybe 15 men left in fighting condition." By dawn on January 22, the situation was hopeless. The few Americans who had crossed the river were surrounded, out of ammunition, and without hope of reinforcement or resupply. German infantry closed in, and most of the survivors, including Private White, were captured. "When the Germans came, we had no choice but to surrender," White recalled. "We were out of ammo, most of us were wounded, and there was no way out. The German officer who took us prisoners spoke perfect English. He said, 'For you, the war is over.' In a way, I was lucky. At least I was alive. So many others weren't." White was among approximately 500 Americans captured by German forces. Others weren't so fortunate. The bodies of 430 American soldiers were recovered by German troops on their side of the river alone. Many more were never found, swept away by the swift current, or buried in unmarked graves. January 23, 1944, 0800, the survivors of the 36th Division staggered back to their assembly areas. In just 48 hours, they had lost over 2,100 men killed, wounded, or captured, nearly half their combat strength. The assault had been a complete failure, achieving none of its objectives. When division casualties were assessed after the attack, there was some question as to whether the 36th could even continue as a fighting unit due to the appalling losses, military historians would later write. The wounded waited hours for treatment in field hospitals that were completely overwhelmed. Medical supplies ran low, and doctors worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Amputations were common due to the combination of combat wounds and frostbite from the freezing river. On average, soldiers wounded on the Rapido received definitive treatment 9 hours and 41 minutes after they were hit, a medical study later found. For many, this delay proved fatal. Others survived, but would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. As the survivors huddled in their foxholes, German artillery continued to pound their positions. The monastery of Monte Cassino still stood untouched on its mountain, a silent witness to the slaughter below. General Walker was devastated by the losses. In his diary, he wrote, "My worst fears have been realized. We have lost nearly half the division for no appreciable gain. The men fought with extraordinary courage against impossible odds, but courage alone could not overcome the tactical realities of the situation. I feel personally responsible for each life lost, though I did everything in my power to prevent this disaster. The blame ultimately lies with those who ordered this attack, despite all contrary advice. The dead were collected and buried in temporary graves, later to be transferred to permanent military cemeteries. Personal effects were gathered to be sent home to grieving families. Letters had to be written, hundreds of them, to parents, wives, and children, explaining that their loved ones would not be coming home. Captain William Stringer, Walker's aide, recalled, "I've never seen the general so affected. He insisted on personally signing every letter to the families of the dead. It took days. Sometimes his hand would shake so badly that he had to stop and compose himself. He'd known this would happen, had tried to prevent it, but in the end, he felt responsible. These were my boys," he kept saying. "These were my Texas boys." For the men of the 36th Division, the horror of the Rapido River crossing would never fade. The survivors made a pact. When the war ended, they would demand accountability for what they considered a needless sacrifice of American lives. Private First Class Bill Hartung, one of the few survivors from his company, described the scene at the river in a letter to his parents that was intercepted by military censors and never delivered. There were bodies everywhere, mostly parts, arms, legs, some decapitated, bodies with hardly any clothes left on. And there was always that spine-chilling cry for medic. But there weren't any left. They had all been blown up by mines or hit by German shells, or swept down the raging river and drowned. Sergeant Billy Kirby's recollection was equally haunting. Boats were being hit all around me and guys falling out and swimming. I never knew whether they made it or not. The river was moving so fast, and the water was so cold. If you went in with all your equipment, you were going down. No question about it. In the days following the disaster, rumors circulated that the attack had been ordered despite intelligence reports indicating the Germans had significant forces protecting the opposite side of the river. Some soldiers believed they had been sacrificed needlessly as a diversion for the Anzio landings. Others blamed General Clark personally for ordering an attack that military history suggested could not succeed. The truth was more complex. The attack was indeed intended to draw German forces away from Anzio, but Clark genuinely believed it could succeed with proper execution. The intelligence failure was not in identifying German strength, but in underestimating the physical challenges of the river crossing and overestimating the ability of artillery to suppress German defenses. Regardless of the strategic justifications, for the men who survived the Rapido, it remained a senseless slaughter. As one unnamed soldier put it in a Stars and Stripes interview, "If you weren't wounded, captured, or killed, you weren't at Rapido." While the 36th Division struggled to recover from its losses, the battle for Monte Cassino continued. The U.S. 34th Infantry Division took over the main attack role, attempting to outflank the German positions by advancing through the mountains north of Cassino. They too would suffer heavy casualties in the rugged terrain. On February 15, 1944, in one of the most controversial decisions of the Italian campaign, Allied bombers dropped 1,400 tons of explosives on the ancient monastery atop Monte Cassino, reducing it to rubble. The bombing was based on the incorrect belief that German troops were using the monastery as an observation post. In reality, while German observers were positioned on the mountain slopes, they had respected the neutrality of the historic building itself. Ironically, the bombing made the tactical situation worse for the Allies. German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division quickly occupied the ruins, which provided even better defensive positions than the intact structure. The rubble created perfect cover for machine gun nests and sniper positions, making subsequent Allied assaults even more costly. For the men of the 36th Division, The monastery's destruction seemed a fitting symbol of the entire Italian campaign, a massive expenditure of force that achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Private James White, meanwhile, began his journey into captivity. Along with hundreds of other prisoners from the 36th Division, he was marched north toward German prisoner of war camps. The journey was arduous, with little food and inadequate shelter in the winter weather. Some men died along the way from wounds, exposure, or exhaustion. White recalled, "We walked for days, sometimes 20 miles a day. Anyone who fell behind was prodded with bayonets or rifle butts." The Germans weren't particularly cruel. They were just following orders and were themselves short on supplies. We slept in barns or fields, ate whatever we could find, or what the occasional sympathetic Italian civilian would sneak to us. Back in the United States, families began receiving the dreaded telegrams. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, husband, father, has been reported missing in action since 20 January in Italy." For parents like James and Elizabeth White, the news was devastating. They clung to hope that their son might be among the prisoners rather than the dead. It would be weeks before they received confirmation. Based on the information received through the Provost Marshal, general records of the War Department have been amended to show your son, Private James D. White, is now a prisoner of war of the German government. "That telegram relieved my mom considerably," White later said. "At least she knew that I was alive." With his POW address in their possession, White's parents began sending letters, food packages, and cigarettes to their son. Several order receipts for camels, mailed to servicemen at the time by the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, are contained in White's scrapbook. One is dated August 14, 1944. For those families who received confirmation of death, the grief was overwhelming. The 36th Division had been drawn primarily from Texas and Oklahoma National Guard units. In some small towns, the losses from a single company hit the community with devastating impact. Churches held memorial services, often for multiple young men from the same congregation. Gold Star banners appeared in windows throughout neighborhoods, each one representing a life cut short at the Rapido River. March 18, 1946. More than a year after the war's end, Andrew J. May, chairman of the Military Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives, called to order hearings on the Rapido River crossing. Veterans of the 36th Division testified about what they called one of the most colossal blunders of the Second World War, a murderous blunder that every man connected with this undertaking knew was doomed to failure before it took place. The congressional investigation had been initiated at the insistence of the 36th Division Association, an organization of veterans who had made a solemn pact during the war to seek accountability for what they viewed as the needless sacrifice of their comrades. The Texas state legislature had passed a resolution supporting their efforts, and political pressure had mounted to examine the decisions that led to the disaster. Colonel Miller Ainsworth, president of the 36th Division Association, testified before Congress about the conditions at the Rapido. The men of the 36th Division were ordered to cross a river against impossible odds. They were facing a strongly fortified enemy position, with inadequate equipment, insufficient training for a river crossing, and without proper reconnaissance. It was a military operation that had no chance of success, and our men knew it. General Walker, who had retired from the Army at the end of the war, provided written testimony that was damning in its critique. "I protested the operation as planned because I did not believe it could possibly succeed. The physical conditions alone, the swift river, the high banks, the flooded approaches, the lack of adequate crossing equipment, made success doubtful. When combined with the strength of the German defenses and their observation from the heights, it became an impossibility. My protests were overruled, and the result was the virtual destruction of 2 fine infantry regiments." General Clark defended his decision, arguing that the attack, while costly, was necessary in the broader strategic context. The Rapido crossing was ordered as part of a coordinated attack all along the Gustav Line, designed to prevent the Germans from moving forces to counter our landing at Anzio. While the crossing itself did not succeed, it did fix German forces in place and contributed to the successful landing at Anzio. In war, difficult decisions must be made that balance tactical risk against strategic necessity. This defense rang hollow to the veterans of the 36th Division. As one survivor put it in testimony, General Clark talks about strategic necessity. We talk about friends who died screaming in the mud. We talk about men who drowned in that freezing river, weighted down by equipment they were ordered to carry. We talk about wounded who bled to death because medical help couldn't reach them. That's the reality of what happened at the Rapido. Despite the emotional testimony and political pressure, the investigation ultimately exonerated Clark. War Secretary Robert P. Patterson issued a report concluding that the action to which the 36th Division was committed was a necessary one, and that General Clark exercised sound judgment in planning it and in ordering it. Colonel Miller Ainsworth, representing the 36th Division Association, publicly rejected this conclusion, criticizing what he perceived as Clark attempting to evade investigation of his conduct. But the official verdict stood, and no further action was taken. For the survivors, this outcome was yet another bitter pill to swallow. They had lost their comrades, and now they felt they had lost the fight for accountability as well. The Rapido crossing became, for them, a double betrayal. First by the commanders who ordered the attack, and then by the system that refused to hold anyone responsible for the disaster. The men who survived the Rapido carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Private White spent 14 months in German prisoner of war camps, enduring hunger, cold, and uncertainty before being liberated in April 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania physically diminished, having lost over 50 pounds during his captivity, and mentally scarred by his experiences. "I do feel a little bit guilty about surviving," White reflected decades later. "How did I make it back when all those other guys around me didn't? And I'm sure they had parents at home praying for them, the same as my mother and dad were praying for me. How did guys as close to me as 5 feet away get hit and I didn't?" This survivor's guilt was common among the veterans of the Rapido. Many struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. In an era before such conditions were widely understood or treated, many men suffered in silence, self-medicating with alcohol or isolating themselves from society. Albert DeFazio returned to combat after recovering from his wound, only to be injured again during the Anzio operation when another artillery strike gave him a concussion. This second injury resulted in his discharge from the Army. He too struggled with PTSD after the war, experiencing nightmares about the river crossing for decades. Joseph Hockadell, a medic who served with the 34th Infantry Division during the later phases of the Monte Cassino battle, developed severe alcohol problems after the war. "I was trying to forget," he later explained. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wounded and the dead, heard their screams. The bottle was the only thing that silenced those screams for a while." Eventually, with his father's help, Hockadell managed to overcome his alcoholism by focusing on learning a trade as an electrician. For many veterans, discussing their experiences at the Rapido was impossible for years or even decades. The horror was too raw, the memories too painful. When they did speak, it was often only to fellow veterans who could understand what they had endured. One such gathering occurred in 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the crossing. A group of survivors met in San Antonio, Texas, at the home of former Sergeant Michael Barella. The men spent the evening sharing memories, honoring their fallen comrades, and finding solace in the company of others who had lived through the same nightmare. Barella's wife, Maria, later recalled, "They started off quiet, just small talk. Then someone mentioned a name. I think it was Captain Chapin. And suddenly they were all talking at once, sharing stories, some of them crying. They talked all night. Michael had never told me much about the war, but that night, listening to them, I began to understand what he had been through." For the families of those who didn't return, the grief never fully subsided. Parents aged and died without ever understanding exactly what had happened to their sons. Wives remarried but kept photographs of their first husbands. Children grew up knowing their fathers only through stories and pictures. Mary Chapin, widow of Captain John Chapin, raised their two children alone after receiving news of his death. In a letter to another officer's widow, she wrote, "The hardest part is not knowing exactly what happened. They say he was lost crossing the river, but there's no grave, no body. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking he might come home, even after all these years." The children ask about him, and I tell them he was a hero, which is true, but I can't tell them how he died, because I don't really know myself. Today, a monument stands near the Rapido River, now correctly identified as the WWII River, commemorating the sacrifice of the 36th Division. It is a rose-colored stone obelisk with inscriptions in both English and Italian. The nearby town of Sant'Angelo in Theodice, which was completely destroyed during the battle and rebuilt afterward, offers a view across the battlefield where so many Americans lost their lives in January 1944. Each year on the anniversary of the crossing, a ceremony is held at the monument. Rose petals are scattered on the river, symbolizing the blood shed there. Veterans, their families, and local Italians gather to remember the tragedy and honor those who fell. In 2012, one of the last surviving veterans of the crossing, Antonio Ruiz of Company E, 141st Regiment, returned to the Rapido for the first time since 1944. Then 88 years old, Ruiz stood silently by the river for several minutes before speaking. "It looks so peaceful now," he said finally. "Hard to believe this is the same place. Back then it was hell on earth. The water was red with blood. I lost my best friends here, men I'd known since we were boys in El Paso. For years I couldn't even look at a river without shaking. Now I'm old, and I wanted to see it once more before I die, to make peace with this place if I can." The monastery of Monte Cassino was rebuilt after the war, using the original plans and as many of the original stones as could be recovered. Today, it once again stands as a place of peace and prayer, though visitors can still see evidence of the battle in the form of bullet holes and shrapnel marks on some of the recovered masonry. Military historians continue to debate the decisions that led to the disaster at the Rapido. Some defend Clark's order as a necessary sacrifice in the broader strategic context. Others condemn it as a needless waste of lives that accomplished nothing. The controversy extends to the bombing of the monastery as well. Was it a tragic mistake based on faulty intelligence, or a necessary action in a desperate situation? What is not debated is the extraordinary courage of the men who attempted the crossing. Despite knowing the odds against them, they did their duty as ordered, displaying a level of valor that earned the respect of even their German opponents. General Frido von Senger und Etterlin, the German commander at Cassino, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans who crossed the Rapido knew they were being sent to their deaths. Yet they came on, wave after wave. Such courage deserves recognition, even from those who were trying to kill them. If they had been supported differently, with better planning and preparation, the outcome might have been different. As it was, their sacrifice was tragic but futile." The Battle of Monte Cassino eventually ended on May 18, 1944, when Polish troops captured the position. The Allies suffered approximately 55,000 casualties compared to 20,000 German losses. Rome was finally liberated on June 4, but by then, world attention had shifted to the D-Day landings in Normandy, which began on June 6. For the survivors of the 36th Division, the horror of those January days in 1944 never faded. Many, like Albert DeFazio and Joseph Hockadell, suffered from PTSD for decades after the war, plagued by nightmares of the doomed river crossing. "If you weren't wounded, captured, or killed," goes a saying among the veterans, "you weren't at Rapido." The lessons of Monte Cassino and the Rapido River disaster remain relevant today. The battle demonstrates the terrible human cost of flawed military planning, the suffering of ordinary soldiers caught in strategic decisions beyond their control, and the lasting psychological trauma of combat. For those who survived the slaughter at the Rapido River, the question that haunted them was not just how such a catastrophe could happen, but why their sacrifice seemed so pointless. In the end, it was the courage and resilience of the individual American soldier that stood in stark contrast to the failures of command. As visitors stand today on the peaceful banks of what was once a river of death, the monument to the 36th Division serves as a reminder that the true horror of war lies not in supernatural elements, but in the documented reality of what humans can endure and inflict upon one another. Private James White, who survived German captivity and returned home to build a life after the war, perhaps summed it up best in an interview shortly before his death in 2018. People ask me if I believe in hell. I tell them I've already seen it. It was at the Rapido River in January 1944. Nothing in any religion could be worse than what we experienced there. The real monsters aren't demons or ghosts. They're flesh and blood, and they're us. That's the most frightening thing of all. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.